3.
Good day, my name is Natasha and I'm doing a presentation on Sir John Ross, Leadership in the Arctic. Sir John Ross was one of the first British explorers in the 1800s. He was a stubborn, heavily criticized man whose life lessons learnt while trapped 4 years in the Arctic were ignored. His amazing feat of surviving with all but one man is underappreciated. As a member of the Royal Navy, Ross is often described as a hardened sailor from an older generation. He was a stout, battle-experienced man covered in scars from his exploits. He was decorated and respected in his early career. He came from humble stock and faced an upward battle against the current British society who favoured nobility and good looks. While no men in the Royal Navy had Arctic experience, they were looking for men with experience in the Baltic, of which Ross had spent 2 seasons. William Parry, who was a tall, good-looking gentleman of noble blood with a good education, was favoured for the position. However, he lacked Ross's experience in the Baltic. He was assigned as Ross's second-in-command. Ross was often liked at first, however this opinion changed as people got to know him. He was hard to work for with his autocratic leadership style. He was the captain, the leader, the man the men must obey and respect. There was little room for criticism and suggestion, as Ross felt it undermined his authority. Ross also felt that as captain he was entitled to take some credit for the discoveries made during his command. His actions caused great many controversies and led the Navy to never give him a command again after 1818. It was 1817 and the Royal British Navy found themselves in a unique position. The War of Napoleon was over, they controlled the seas. Most of the Navy was unemployed, living on half pay, waiting to be called to action. Burroughs, the second Secretary of the Admiralty, was a huge promoter of Arctic exploration. He believed in an open polar sea concept, an idea that above the ice there was a warmer ice-free ocean. He advised the Navy that Arctic exploration was a way to keep the men busy, make discoveries, and hopefully discover the Northwest Passage. The British were optimistic to the point of foolishness. They were overconfident following the war. Nothing could or would stop them, not even the ice. The first Arctic expedition would set sail in 1818. They were conducted in large sailboats. Ross expressed his concerns over the condition of the sailboats. However, the Navy ignored him. They had never built special ships before, and they would not now. This expedition was a peacetime gap filler until the ships would be called for defense of the realm. This first expedition shaped the rest of Ross's life. The primary mission was to discover the Northwest Passage, and secondary was to explore Baffin Bay and area. They sailed around Baffin Bay, hugging the Greenland coast, before moving into Lancaster Sound. As they entered the Sound, Ross experienced a phenomenon, a mirage of sorts, and saw a chain of mountains blocking his way. He named them the Croker Mountains. Ross decided it was time to return home, despite the fact that they were expected and equipped to winter in the Arctic. This was a moment that will haunt Ross for the remainder of his life. The following winter, Parry was given his own command, disproved the Croker Mountains, and traveled further into Lancaster Sound. In the following years, Ross published several works which were heavily criticized. His reputation was tarnished by Parry's discovery, and many of his men had accused him of plagiarizing the work and taking credit for their discoveries. The Navy held a board of inquiry and determined that Ross's attitude and actions were becoming an officer, and he was forced into retirement. The British had sent 5 additional expeditions by sea and 2 by land. These voyages were full of scurvy and death was common. The Navy's diet of salt meat and an ounce of lemon juice a day was thought to be enough to ward off scurvy, despite the evidence to the contrary. Ross had learned from his and other expeditions. He felt that smaller, shallower ships would fare better against the ice. He was able to secure a private sponsor, Mr. Felix Booth, gathered 23 men, and set sail in a steam-powered boat for the Arctic in the summer of 1829. With a steam power and a mild winter, they managed to cross Baffin Bay and into Lancaster Sound in record time. The steam engine produced a great number of difficulties and was abandoned. They sailed into Prince Regent, England, further than Parry had ever been, and wintered in Felix Harbor. This was Ross's second mistake, and would shape the next 4 winters. The first winter, the men ate their salt meat and lemon juice. A group of local Inuit were wintering in the area, and they traded for furs and fresh meat. Ross observed that they were in general good health and scurvy-free. He suspected their diet of seal blubber was the main contributor. The Navy issue of wool was heavy when wet and not suitable for life in the Arctic. The furs kept them warm and allowed them to travel further into the surrounding areas for exploration. Summer came very late in 1830 and was August before the ice started to move. The bay that they had wintered in was shallow, and there was an increasing amount of ice preventing them from sailing. They only managed to go 3 miles before they were forced to drop anchor and settle in for a second winter. This winter was much harder than the first, as the Inuit returned later in the season. They continued to trade furs, fresh meat, and guides for exploration. These trades would ultimately save Ross and his men's lives. Seal blubber is full of vitamin C and helped ward off the scurvy that had yet to make an appearance in Ross's crew. This action was ahead of its time. No one else bothered to ask or observe how the locals managed to live off the land and maintain their health. He was heavily criticized for it by his men, who felt that fish was a diet of savages and not enough to sustain proper men. With furs and guides, they continued to explore the area, making more discoveries. It was late August by the time the ice moved enough for the ship to start sailing. Unfortunately, they only made it 15 miles before they ran aground and broke the ship's rudder. It soon became obvious the ship would never sail again, and come spring they'd be forced to abandon it. They settled in for a third winter, and soon scurvy was upon them. During the third winter, the Inuit never returned at all. Ross and his men had eaten their food, however, they never learned to fish or how to hunt seal. The men were limited in providing themselves with fresh meat, and it showed as scurvy started to settle in. Ross planned to trek north towards Fury Beach, where Perry had wrecked a ship in 1825 and had left supplies. They set up food caches along the way, making multiple trips to lay food in boats for the journey. By this winter, the men were tense and dreading the long hike. While they slept a lot, they were short-tempered and snappish. This spring, there was the first talk of mutiny. Ross was forcing men forward with limiting food. Half rations were often issued despite their hard work and long days. He wanted to make the food supplies last. It was July before they made it to Fury Beach. They discovered most of the boats left behind were in good conditions, and supplies had indeed been left behind. They made a house, started repairing the boats and rigging them with sails. They intended to sail into Baffin Bay and see the whalers before they returned home for the winter. They were able to complete the journey and were forced to return to Fury Beach. Winter was upon them when they returned, and they were very thankful to have arrived at the shelter already built. Their fourth and final winter was spent at Fury Beach, away from the warmth and safety of their ship. It is here that they lost their first and only man. Once again, they placed food caches along the route, preparing for the long hike. The journey to Batty Bay would be a long one, as many men were unable to walk and required to be pulled in the sled, and only a handful of men were capable of pulling the sleds. When they arrived, it was another month before the ice cleared up enough for the men to set sail. A few weeks later, they had seen sails and were able to be rescued. They returned home to England that October. This man's place in history will forever be tarnished by a mistake he made in 1818. The disputes with his men over discoveries and discrepancies in his own findings led to his opinion not being valued within the Arctic community. Ross was ahead of his time. He was one of the few who thought the Inuit had anything worthwhile to teach the Europeans. They contributed to many of his and his men's discoveries made during the voyage. Society at the time considered Inuit to be savage barbarians, and the help that Ross and his men received is often downplayed. The Navy would not adopt their ways despite the fact that Ross's men were in better health, despite their long stay in the Arctic, than any other expedition. They continued to issue wool and lemon juice. The mindset, the bigger the better, prevailed. It was very unfortunate, as Ross's survival rate was higher than anyone else's. The attitude became that if Ross, a room Navy captain, could do it, then it can't be that hard, it can't be that difficult. When the Navy asked him about the Northwest Passage, Ross informed them he thought it would be absolutely useless, and yet the Navy continued to send more expeditions into the North and believing in an open polar seas concept. Ross advised Benjamin Franklin while he was preparing and planning his expedition. In typical Navy fashion, it was the biggest ship with the largest crew sent out. Ross argued against the extra fuel to keep the men warm, the size and depth of the ship, and the size of the crew. He suggested they swap the fuel for food, bring furs, and leave food caches along the way. After all, it was pairs of men and supplies that saved Ross and his men during that fourth winter. Ross was ignored by all. Despite being considered the best equipped expedition, Franklin and all 123 men perished. Ross's suggestion for smaller, shallower ships and a limited number of skilled crewmen is exactly what Royal Amundsen used to discover and traverse the Northwest Passage from 1903 to 1906. I find Ross's story inspirational because he managed to do what no one else did. He survived. It takes a lot of strength and thick skin to accomplish what he did. His men were regularly unhappy with him. He cut their liquor supply, reduced rations, forced them to eat fish, pushed them hard and far, but he got them out alive. Ross's leadership is built upon hard decisions. His autocratic leadership style was unpopular, and many of his men openly disliked his decisions. He did it anyways. Had he listened to his men, or taken the British opinion of the time, they all would have perished, trapped in the ice. Thank you for listening.